Well, hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's Brian Griffiths. I'm one of the clergy in the United Parish of Chinnor. And because I didn't step back quick enough, I find myself as the chairman of an organisation called Chinnor Churches Go Wild, which is a kind of group of churches in the Chinnor area who have a heart for eco things and are working together with two lovely organisations, Arosha, and we're one of the partners in Action, and also the Chilterns Conservation Board, which is where Katie comes in. We've done a lot of work with them already. We've done surveys, organisations, tours, activities, and today's talk on churchyard wildlife is just one of those, and we hope will expand into the future. Keep your eye on this space. So that's the background, and this is a Chinnor Churches Go Wild presentation. And thank you, Katie, very much. I have got Katie's CV here, which is so impressive. She did an undergraduate degree and worked for 10 years in the Forestry Commission and Bolton Council before moving to Switzerland, international dimensions. And she worked there and got a master's degree and a PhD in ecology. And she then came back to the UK in 2018 and started working for the Wildlife Trust in her current role. And her interest is really in supporting people to take action where they live and work to give nature a helping hand, which is just what we're trying to do today. So knowing of Katie's expertise, I'm really looking forward to this. So off you go, Katie. Welcome, and hope it all's good for you as you explain all your things. And I'm now going to put myself on mute.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, if I just ask anyone who's got their microphone or their video on, it's a good idea to turn it off for us at the moment. That's got somebody just joining now, that's great. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, Brian. So just to give you a little bit more context about me, my name's Katie Horgan, and I actually work for Berks, Bucks and Oxon Wildlife Trust. But we're a partner with the Conservation Board in their landscape partnership scheme, which is called Chalk, Cherries and Chairs. And some of you may have heard about this, I'm not sure, but I've put a link to that scheme on the end of the presentation. So my job title is Rough Around the Edges. And really that job is very much about, as Brian has said, supporting local groups to look after and improve local areas for wildlife. And it's often kind of small spaces that maybe don't have a lot of other input into them. And so obviously part of that role is my supporting role with Chinnor Churches Go Wild, to help the group with some funding and some advice with things that can be done in churchyards to notice the wildlife that's around them. Now, maybe one question that might come up is, well, why are we talking about churchyards? They have a very specific use. They're very important for people as places of rest and contemplation. They're important that we preserve them for peace for us, and they have quite a specific use for us. But my response to that would be, well, because that's how we value them and how we use them, that actually creates spaces that wildlife is also able to find space within. So we're often sharing those churchyards and those contemplative spaces with other beings and other creatures around us. And so part of the project is as much about noticing what is there as much as trying to do anything different within the churchyard. And I also want to add, of course, a churchyard's usually been undisturbed for quite a long period of time. So you have grass and that in there that maybe hasn't had agricultural inputs, for example. And that is actually, because of that, it has actually a wide diversity of flowers within it if it's allowed to grow. But also you have older trees, you have headstones and buildings that are there. So they're largely undisturbed spaces, often within a landscape that has a lot of disturbance around it. So they really are quite often refuges for wildlife as well as for us. So part of the point of the project is just to try and recognise that. And so if we take that theme of thinking about, that picture I just had up, which had lots of headstones in it, as you can see here. This picture you can see on the right is the top of one of the headstones. I think this is in St Andrew's Church, where I took the picture. And it's just the top of the headstone, and you can see on that it's covered in lichen. And this is a very common sight in the churchyard. Now, I'm not a lichenologist, so I can't identify them for you, but I'm pretty sure there are at least 4 species of lichen on that headstone. You can see the orange on there, then there's the white crustaceous kind of underneath it. Even these patches of black are lichen as well. So already we can see there's a lot because the stone's been there for a long time, but also a churchyard usually has quite a variety of stone in it that you might not find in the wider landscape. So particularly for lichenologists, in fact, they get very excited about churchyards because you can find a wide variety in a very small space, and it's very easy to study them. And as you can see from the numbers I've put here, about a third of British species, there are about 2,000 species of lichen that we know of in the UK, and about a third of those 600 species have been found in churchyards in lowland England. Now, we haven't done a survey yet in the churchyards in Chinnor. We did have some work planned for last year, but of course circumstances overtook us, so we haven't been able to do that yet. But often you find rarities in churchyards because of the rock types that we have in there, and also the different microclimates that you can get in the churchyard. And just, I'm sorry if people know this already, but just to point out, a lichen's quite a specific organism. It's actually usually a symbiosis, so a relationship between 2 different organisms, and a fungi, and then something that photosynthesizes. It's usually an algae, and the fungus provides kind of a structure for the algae to sit in, but the algae photosynthesizes energy from sunlight and provides carbon to the fungi so it can grow. So it's this very kind of mutual relationship that they have together. So they're very interesting, they're very slow growing, and they're actually quite dependent on places like churchyards to have that diversity of species. So that's lichen on rocks. But of course we have other kind of rock and stone within the churchyard. So most churchyards of course have a wall built around them. Here you can see a brick wall again. I think this is in St Andrew's Church, although St Andrew's also has some stone wall around it, natural stone. Sydenham also has natural stone wall around it. In fact, all of the churches do, including Methodist Church. So these are of course habitat for lichens to grow, but they also, walls are really important as routeways for wildlife. So you often find kind of runways along them for things like hedgehogs or maybe small mammals that use them, because the wall provides a little bit of shelter for them in a safer space than being out in the open area. We know we've got hedgehogs in the churchyards. There have been some hedge boxes put in place in them that were provided by A. Rocha. We haven't counted how many, but we do know that they're using those spaces. And part of the reason for that is because they've got these safe routeways. But they're also really important for as providing warming up spaces, because as spring comes out, the weather today's been quite warm, the rock starts to warm up. So all those animals that don't generate their own heat, so reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates, they need rock and stone to provide them extra warmth so that they can start to get going at the beginning of the season, but also later on to provide energy. So often you will find a wall is kind of, you'll find things resting on it. Now, it would be nice if I could say we have lots of lizards on them, but that's not strictly true. But you often find butterflies, for example, might stop and just rest there, or bees where they're trying to just get a bit more energy before they continue to fly. And then, of course, added to that, and you can see that in this brick wall, there's lots of cracks and crevices. So they're providing also somewhere for wildlife to live. Lots of solitary bees, for example, lots of our wild bees build their nests in holes in walls. So they lay an egg, then they close off that compartment, they lay another egg. So they use the cracks that you have in these walls as habitat for them, for their larvae to develop in. So the walls that you find within churchyards, as well as in other spaces, are really important for wildlife. And of course, they're very common, and they're often a rich habitat covered in mosses and ferns and lichens, depending on the climate that you've got in the area. And as you can see from this picture, it's not just the wall that's important. Because we've got a boundary here, what's happened in this case is it's not been mown right to the very edge. Sometimes that's not possible. I think actually here probably we've got perhaps some old sticks or things underneath, so it's not easy to mow it. But that means you get this kind of rough grass, these rough edges that are additional habitat for wildlife. And here we've got a lovely picture of slow worms, and I'm pretty sure these ones were in St Andrew's Church as well, although we did find them in Crowell. where against that rough edge, we put down some reptile mats. These are the very simplest ones, are just a square of roofing felt. And in early spring, those squares, those black squares, heat up really quickly, and you're hibernating actually all kinds of creatures, but the hope is that hibernating lizards and other reptiles will move under those mats to warm up a bit more, to then give them the energy to move on, to move through their territory and to start to breed. And we had them certainly in both churchyards, and I think we had them in Sydenham as well last year. You can also see to the left of this photo that those are actually ants' eggs that you can see on the left-hand side, and you can just about make out the ants that are on there. So that square of felt is providing this very warmed up habitat amongst that rough grass for reptiles, slow worms in this case, to live in. We also had grass snakes certainly at Crowell Church, which is always an exciting find. And you often will find frogs, toads and newts using them as well, because actually slugs quite like to be underneath there, and the frogs and toads will use that as foraging space to feed from. But the rough edges, I mentioned hedgehogs before, so these rough grassy edges, as you saw in the previous picture, here you go, that's providing kind of damp habitat for invertebrates such as slugs and snails, and the hedgehogs are quite dependent on them as food. So as soon as you have just a small area of rough grass, you're already increasing that space that you've got for other wildlife to live in, and it doesn't have to be very big. And actually within churchyards, I think the majority of churchyards, because of the grass cutting and looking after the burial areas, you usually have quite extensive compost bins. And so there's always somewhere within a churchyard a space that wildlife will be using for heating up, for foraging, for feeding. And although obviously we don't want those to be unsightly, and maybe we need to hide those or put them in an area that's not so visible to people, they are actually providing very, very valuable habitat for wildlife. Although you can't see it in that previous picture, I don't think there's a patch of nettles in there, but I wanted to say sometimes those weedy plants that aren't so popular, for example nettles, they're really important for butterflies, for example. So peacock and red admiral butterflies will lay their eggs on nettle, and the caterpillars then will feed on the nettle before they pupate and become butterflies. So some plants that we maybe don't find so attractive are actually doing quite a lot of work for wildlife. Similarly, our birds that maybe nest low to the ground, you're going to find those nesting in brambles and in rough edges like that. So wrens, sparrows and robins, for example, will take great advantage of these rough edges that we have around the churchyard. But it's not all about it looking rough and unkempt. It's also about the grass that's in the churchyard. And most churchyards, the majority of the space in them is grass, and it is grass that's mown. And I wouldn't want anyone to kind of think that only having rough and unkempt areas is good for wildlife. Short grass also does benefit wildlife. Because the grass is short, it's easy for birds who feed on insects to actually forage within that grass and pick out of the soil the worms and the larvae that they feed on. And also you often find a lot of low growing plants, the ones that are used to being eaten by sheep in fact, survive quite well in short mown grass. And actually, in the same way that I talked about those reptile mats that heat up, short grass means that the soil heats up very quickly. And then what happens, everyone will have seen kind of clouds of midges and gnats that maybe come out at certain times of the year, also flying ants. They'll have come out because the larvae are just below the surface in the soil, and it will have heated up enough for them to hatch and then to come out as flying insects. Now, that's not so pleasant for us. However, that's when then you start to see birds such as swifts and swallows low flying over those short grass areas and feeding off the insects that are coming out. So short grass, although many people in conservation will talk against cutting grass, short grass has its value. And of course, from our point of view as people who want to access the graveyard, and want to be able to walk around it, we need that short grass. It's not without value for wildlife. I've also put on here fungi, so most people will be familiar with fairy rings. Fungi can't really cope with long grass, so when you have got short grass, that's when you're more likely to see toadstools coming up in grassed areas. Okay, so that's short grass, and by short grass I really mean grass that's cut maybe once or twice, maybe once a week or once a fortnight. But then of course there's also space, or there's potential to have space for long and rough grass within some of the churchyards, and this depends very much on how the churchyard is being used, how the local congregation feel about how that's being used, and also where it's really just where it's appropriate and where it's manageable for the people that are looking after that space. This photograph is from Sydenham, and in fact I don't know if you can see that it has got long grass in it, but actually mute that one. I've just muted a couple of you, sorry. That grass has actually been cut. It's probably cut quite early in the season, but then it won't be cut. Maybe it'll be left between May and June, and then it can be cut again a bit later in the summer. So long grass doesn't mean never cutting it. It just means giving it a little bit longer to grow in places where that's possible to do that. And in some cases, it's also because it's very difficult to access. But it's important to have some areas of long grass if you're able to, because, and I'm only talking about the grass, this can have really high value. There we go. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback in there. I'm just going to mute. I'm going to mute everybody just so we don't get the feedback coming through. Yeah, long grass is really important because actually a lot of butterflies depend on it for as a food plant for their caterpillars. So species such as meadow brown or gatekeeper, the little brown butterflies, basically, they will lay their eggs on grasses. They will hatch, and the larva, the caterpillar, will feed on the grass before it then becomes a butterfly. So when we talk about long grass, of course, what we'd like is to have lots of flowers, but there's high value in having just grasses in there as well. Now you can see in this picture, I think we've got wild carrot at the front of it, and there are some other flowering plants at the back. And of course, those flowering plants are also then important for nectar feeding pollinators, so butterflies, bees, but also other flies and invertebrates that act as pollinators. And of course, then you've got also things like grasshoppers and more plant bugs who are living within the long grass, and that increases the food for frogs and toads, or for other small mammals, and of course for the birds who visit those areas. So where we can have long grass and where it works. And I must say that the churchyard at Sydenham and at Aston Rowan, actually they're large spaces, and so we have some small pockets where we're able to leave the grass a little bit longer, but it doesn't mean that it's never cut. In fact, it's important that it is cut and the grass cuttings are taken away, because that keeps the fertility low and it allows the flowers to come back year on year. And it does also mean that we're able to keep it looking managed. And so Crowell Church have left some areas of long grass, and that's been really interesting to see what's come through. We did a count 2 years ago now, and we had at least 20 species of different grasses and flowering plants coming through at Crowell Church, and we didn't need to add anything to that. That's just what comes through naturally. Also within this area in the Chilterns, although I think most of the churches are not necessarily on chalk, several people I've spoken to, not in the churchyard so far, but you do find orchids coming up. Actually, I might be wrong about that. I might need to check. I think we had some orchids come up at Crowell. So you do often find orchids will come through as well if you leave an area of grass coming up. I've also put rough grass in there because if you do leave the grass uncut for a long time, it becomes very tussocky. Now, although that has wildlife value, that does become difficult to manage in a churchyard, and I don't think we really have areas that are like that in the Chinnor churches at the moment. Okay, so I've talked about stone and walls and boundaries and grasses and things that we manage, but it's really important, I think, to talk about trees. And I've put veteran and evergreen trees here. Now, by veteran tree, and Brian, I said to you the other night that a veteran tree is 400 years old, but that's actually not strictly true. There's not a fixed number of years for a veteran tree. It's just a very old tree, and the number of years might depend on kind of the species and where it's growing. But the reason it's important to talk about this in the context of churchyards, and you can see here, this is Aston Rowan Church. You can see the 2 yew trees growing either side of the picture here. That when we talk about churchyards, we're very often talking about yew trees that grow in churchyards. Yew, hands down in the UK, is the oldest tree that grows here. There's one in St Cynog in Dyfynnog in Wales, and there's also the Fortingal yew in Perth, and they're both estimated to be around 2,000 to 3,000 years old. They're extremely old trees. They do decay over time, so they're not really recognisable as trees. They look more like a ring, but we do know that that ring is what remains of the yew tree. And the reason that they're associated with churchyards, as many of you will know this, I think, is that they were often there. They're often pre-Christian, so the tree can quite often predate the building that's in place. But also because of this age and the longevity of yew trees, they have a particular kind of cultural symbolism for us, which is partly why they're left in churchyards. So they're seen to be sacred trees or symbols of everlasting life, and that's probably mostly because of their evergreen nature. We don't have a huge number of native evergreen trees in the UK. So they become, what's happened in fact is that the UK has become internationally quite important as a refuge for veteran yew trees. In fact, for veteran trees, but within churchyards, particularly yew trees. So the yew tree in your churchyard is really important from a kind of a spiritual, a cultural and a wildlife point of view. I should add, yew's not the only tree that's in there. In this picture, you can see the box hedge also at Aston Rowan Church. Unfortunately, it is suffering a bit with blight, but that tends to be everywhere. But interestingly, in this area, we do have a lot of box trees in the area. Behind Aston Rowan Church, actually, there's quite a few patches of older box as well. And it's very slow growing. So although it looks quite small, those are also quite old trees that we have there. But we'll also find older oaks and a lot of the boundary trees, or the holly. Often the holly that's growing in there is also very old. From a wildlife point of view, this age is really important because in general, the older a tree becomes, the more value it has for wildlife. So the number of invertebrates, for example, that are able to live on the tree is increased. Those trees have cracks and fissures in them, just the same as we talked about with the wall, where things can hide. They also have holes in that become roosts for things like woodpeckers and owls and bat roosts. So the trees become increasingly important as they become older. They also, yew tree not so much, because they actually are quite toxic apart from the fleshy part of the berry. But even so, they will also host having things like other mosses and ferns and lichens growing on them as well. So the trees that are in the churchyard become very important in themselves for wildlife. And we know that, within all of the churchyards in Chinnor, there are several trees in them that are really important for wildlife. This is partly reflected. We've done last year and the year before, supported by Chiltern Conservation Board, by Nick Mariner. We did some bird walks through the churchyards, and in 2019 there were 30 different species recorded across the churches. It was 26 last year, so it was a bit lower, although these numbers are often affected by the weather. And we will aim to do another walk this year to see what those numbers look like again. So we are trying to record the birds, and part of the reason why we get that diversity is because we have these big trees, we have hedges, we have lots of feeding spaces for them as well. So they become really important for the birds that are using them. Okay. So let's move on. So that's the things that are in the churchyard, and the trees, which we consider important, but also, of course, we have the church building that's in there. And while we can be quite restricted with what we can do actually to the building in terms of doing anything for wildlife, it's important to recognise that without actually doing anything different to the building, it's already being used by the other creatures that are in and around the church. Now, of course, the classic is to talk about bats within the tower, and we occasionally have that, but bats do get quite disturbed by the noise from bells if you have them. But what you'll also find is they might use them sometimes for roosts at different times of the day, because bats don't have one roost. They tend to move around depending on the weather or where the sunlight is coming from. So they might use them for resting at certain times, but they might not hibernate in them, for example. But of course, as I've mentioned with the trees, the bats will also be using them and then feeding around the rest of the building. But we also know that we have swifts, certainly at Sydenham, and we're pretty sure we have them at Aston Rowan as well. We have recorded them at all 4 churches, we just don't know if they're nesting at all 4 churches. Swifts are not disturbed in the same way by noise, so having the building there becomes really important for swifts. Nationally their numbers are declining, so anything that we have that benefits where they can nest is really important. Also, I just wanted to say for bats, I just pulled this number off the bat I think it's the bat recording website, but at least half of the known UK species are known to use church buildings and churchyards for roosting and feeding in. So we know that these churchyards and spaces are really important. Partly as well because the grounds are providing a lot of food for them, as I discussed earlier, in particular moths. And last year, no, the year before last, we did do a moth night at St Andrew's Church and caught a huge number of moths actually that we were able to look at, and hopefully we'll do that again along with some bat walks as well when we're able to get out. Now, I've mentioned all of the buildings and the churchyards, and these are with 4 of the churches. They have large churchyards, they have buildings, so there's lots of space for wildlife. But we do also have the Methodist Church, which and Rod from the church is here this evening. Of course, it's a much smaller space, it doesn't have any grounds around it, but it does actually do quite a lot for wildlife as well, because they have some log piles at the back. There's some bee homes and bird nest boxes on that building where they've been able to put those up, and so those are also things that can be done to enhance churchyards and smaller spaces for wildlife if you're able to put them up and if that fits with what's possible within that space. But what I wanted to say is a lot of what's been done by Chinnor Churches Go Wild, they're not huge changes that have been made to the churchyards. They're very small, but they're small ones that enhance the space for wildlife and actually allow people to notice a bit more what's around them once they're there. And I kind of wanted to finish by saying that these small actions that have been taken, they're also actions that you can take at home. So if you've got space at home, then you can have log and rock piles, or you can put up nest boxes and reptile mats. And so these are all things that are fairly straightforward to do if you wanted to know more about how to do it. And of course, a lot of this work within the churchyards has been done by volunteers and by the church wardens. So we really kind of have to thank them for the hard work that's put in to creating such lovely spaces for wildlife. So there's kind of a big thank you to them for everything they've been doing. And I kind of wanted to, well, 2 things I wanted to say. One is that if you're interested in more of this from your own point of view, we will be running some more talks from the Wildlife Trust that I'll put a link to at the end of this. But also, if you've kind of enjoyed looking at the pictures and finding out a bit more of this general overview, please do feel free to take a bit of time, if you're local, to have a walk around your local churchyard and just notice perhaps what's in there a little bit more. And if you'd like to kind of support the group, please do get in touch with Chinnor Churches Go Wild. Now that was quite short and quite a whistle stop through. These are the links that I said I'd leave for you. But I'm very happy to kind of open this to kind of questions that anyone has about about what I've talked about, or any questions you have about the churchyards, and I might be able to answer some, but it might be that some of the members of Chinnor Churches Go Wild can help as well with the questions and answers. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and if you want to ask a question, maybe you can raise your hand and we can find you and answer, or otherwise write a question in the chat. And feel free to unmute yourselves or put your videos on.
Katie, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. I've learnt a new word.
Have you?
Lichenologist?
Yep. Yes, there are certainly lichenologists or lichenologists, depending on how you
Yep.
Yeah. I'm just going to check the chat because I think there were a couple of questions in there. Yeah, Fiona, you asked, how does lichen benefit the environment? So lichen does a number of things. One is that you often find they're often good indicators of air quality. So depending on the kind of lichen that you've got growing, you can get an idea of how polluted the air is. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but the example I'd like to give is if you go to the west coast of Scotland, for example, they have the most incredible lichens that grow on the trees there. Now, that's partly to do with the humid atmosphere, but it's also because the air is very clean. And if you know your lichens, you can get a good indication of air quality from the kinds of lichens that are growing. And so then the answer to how do they benefit is partly, I mean, they're not filtering a huge amount, but they are responding to pollutants in the air. They're also fed on by various invertebrates. Slugs and snails will feed on them, for example. So they do provide food for some organisms as well. But Fiona, you also asked, when's the best or worst time to do a church ground clear up, and best advice when we do? Okay, that's quite a big question, I think. Probably the worst time in terms of, let's say, cutting grass or clearing things, I would say is between April and June. So I would try not to do anything that disturbs wildlife at that time. Very specifically to trees and nesting birds, generally in conservation, we follow a rule of nothing after the 15th of February and nothing before the end of August in terms of cutting trees or hedges, because you usually have nesting birds. When the weather warms up now, I mean, most of you probably will have heard the birds are much more active at the moment. They're starting to look for nesting sites, and if you have a warm February, they can start nesting as early as mid-February. And some birds have second broods, so we try and leave it as late as possible before we start cutting hedges back. But that's very specific to hedges. So I would say kind of late spring, early summer is when you try and leave things alone as much as possible. And the best time, generally winter, which is maybe not the best time for us because it's cold and wet, but generally winter's better for clearing up. But of course it's a churchyard, so there's always jobs to do throughout the year. And as far as advice, I think that depends very much on where you are and what you want to do. Let me just check. How important is ivy in the churchyard? Ivy always has a kind of a mixed response. Really important, I would say. It's evergreen, it's late flowering, so the late flowers and then the late berries often provide a very late food source for birds. If you're lucky to have ivy mining bee, so it's a little solitary bee, that depends on the flowers of ivy that come out. So they come out very late summer, so end of August, September, you tend to find them. It's great habitat for birds who want to nest in it. But of course, if you've got ivy that's beginning to take over a tree or choke it, it might be that you need to take it out because it's causing a problem with the stability of the tree. But that's an assessment that you need to do yourself. And I know that in some areas, maybe ivy's kind of taken over and nothing else is able to grow. So I think it's just a question of, can you get a balance with the ivy and the other things that are growing there? But I would always say leave a bit. And if you've got it on walls, it's really good habitat for all sorts of wildlife that's in there. And are there any more questions? Oh, somebody mentioned the orchids at Chinnor Station. Yes, so if you're local, they have a fantastic patch in the car park at Chinnor Station that in general in the summer is covered in orchids. So it's a really lovely spot to go and find them. Joe asked, bit morbid. Is the soil specifically enhanced by the decaying bodies? I hope everyone's okay with this. It will make a difference, although, to be honest, earthworm activity is generally in the first, I don't know, well, actually 6 inches to a foot of the soil. So actually they don't go very deep. So most of the activity, most of the soil microbes and what's going on in the soil is really in that top layer. Anyone who's maybe got an allotment, I know Rod's got several allotments, so he's more of an expert than me, but if you're digging deep in your soil, if you're doing no dig, this is relevant. In fact, it's not irrelevant. If you're digging deep in your soil, you'll find that you don't get earthworms as you dig deeper. Part of the point of a no dig method is because that activity is happening in that top layer, so you're encouraging earthworms to come up and do the work at that top layer, and that's partly because of the temperature things that I was talking about as well. So moisture and light and nutrients that are getting through to them that they're working on. But it's an interesting question, Joe, and I'm not sure if there might be a bit more information about that somewhere. Not an expert with that. Loretta's asked, if you want to grow a patch of grass long, do you just leave it to grow, or do we seed anything? So my advice is let it grow long the first year and see what you've got, because you might find you let it grow long and it is full of things that you didn't know were there. If you let it grow long and you've basically just got grass, then you need to start thinking about scarifying it and adding some seed into it and seeing if you can encourage more things to grow. But I would always say, first time, see what you've got in there before you start adding seed to it for a wildflower patch. And I would say, specifically in a churchyard, you absolutely should do that for all the reasons that I said at the beginning. It's largely undisturbed, not all of it, but you have patches that are largely undisturbed. They certainly haven't had fertilizers added, which when you add fertilizer, that basically encourages grass growth and nothing else. And you might find you've got rare species. My local church, I don't live locally, they've discovered a nationally rare species just from allowing the grass to grow there, and now have that as kind of a little protected patch within the churchyard. And they wouldn't have known that had they not allowed it to grow. And looked, of course, part of it's just the noticing. Okay. Oh, I don't know the answer to this question from Sergio. Is it actually legally possible to ease anyone's burying anywhere? I don't quite know what the question is. The only thing I don't know if this answers your question, Sergio. After a certain amount of time, a churchyard is not used for a long time. Jackie might be able to help with this, I don't know. If it's not used for a long time, it's not used actively for burials. Well, I don't know what the period of time is. For example, my local churchyard, there's no longer active burials. There haven't been for a long time, and the management of that churchyard has passed to the parish council. It's no longer within the church's gift to do that. But I don't know what the time period is on that. That's a more specialist question than I can answer, Sergio.
There is quite a bit.
Is that the right answer to the question? I don't know. Maybe someone else can help me with that, Brian.
What I was going to say is that I know from some teaching I did with the curates, there's a lot of information about funerals and what you can do in churchyards on the diocesan site. And so if you've got a specific question, Sergio, perhaps you could kind of focus it more and we can try and find out.
I would also say I've talked about all of this, but what's really important maybe for me to say, I'm not sure if I made it clear. I mean, nothing is done in the churchyard without, obviously with Chinnor Churches Go Wild, they're all, the group are all members of the church, and it's all done in discussion, and we make sure that it's agreed what's being done. So always, and much of the work done in the churchyards, of course, is done by the wardens. So it's always done in discussion with people who are responsible for it. We don't just go in and do something. So I think that's just important to make that clear. And anyone got any other questions? They can also do that. Sorry, Brian, carry on.
And archdeacons make sure that that's the case.
Yes, we are checked. Does anyone have any other questions that they want to raise here rather than writing it in the chat?
Katie, Fiona's asked about our future plans for the Chinnor Churches Go Wild?
Maybe you can answer that.
Oh dear.
Sorry, Loretta, put you on the spot.
We've got a plant ID session in June at St Mary's Church in Sydenham, which is going to be hosted by George from Caring for God's Acre.
Beautiful burial ground.
And we're hoping, it depends on what happens with COVID, we're hoping to have a green service with either Katie talking or somebody from Arusha. And then possibly in September, Katie, have a moth count, bat count.
Yeah.
It just depends on COVID and what we can do.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Loretta, carry on.
Is there anything else we want to add, Brian?
I don't know if people are aware of the work Arusha does. It's on our website and very useful to look up. But one of the things that they have done fairly recently is to expand the areas of their interest into gardens. And I think that's such an interesting aspect, particularly with regard to parishioners and their gardens, and indeed the opportunities that opens with children and families doing things in your own garden. So it's not just the churchyard, but it's other bits of kind of space which the church is interested in, i.e. the parishioners.
Yeah.
So there's some opportunities there. And can I also say, if anybody who's listening has got any bright ideas as to things that we could kind of present in forms of lectures or doing things, then please would you tell us. We'd love you to be proactive, because we want this whole programme to kind of gather everybody in Chinnor together who's kind of eco-interested. And I think it's a very, very rich vein for us to do things eco in Chinnor. And thank you so much, Katie.